Joining us via Skype is economic expert Professor Steve Keen. Professor, thank you for joining us. Now, is it likely that France and Italy will be able to bring the deficit in their budget plans in line with EU rules by March?
No, it's not likely. It's almost certain they'll fail to do it, and they should not be trying to do it in the first place because the policies themselves are simply insane.
Now, you've said that it's not likely for them to do that. So if they do not meet the deadline, what will this mean for the EU?
Well, it's looking like they might finally start getting a confrontation over whether these rules should be enforced in the first place, because it's about time Europe took a good look at itself compared to America and even England and said, what are we doing wrong? Because unemployment in France and Italy is running at well over 10%. It's running at 25% in the southern European countries. It's even rising in Germany right now. So something that Europe has been doing is not working. And what it's been doing is enforcing these rules, which are actually pushing the continent further into another Great Depression. So I think it's possibly, if the European Union tries to enforce these rules with those penalties, we might finally get a decent argument over whether the rules should be kept with or should be thrown out. And my vote is very strongly that they should be thrown out.
Now, in your opinion, what is the EU doing wrong?
It's treating the government as if it's a household which has to balance its books. And this is an analogy which people fall into in a very simplistic way, and conventional economics actually reinforces that. But I think what we have to see that the government is make an analogy with it being like a bank rather than like a household. And like a bank, a country will grow if banks lend more money out than they get back in repayments. A similar analogy applies for governments. It's quite sensible for governments to be spending more than they get in as revenue when the economy is growing. Now, if the economy starts to shrink and they also try to tax more than they spend, they amplify the downturn, which is what's happened in Europe. And the real cause of the whole crisis is the private sector trying to get out of debt, but because the government's doing the same thing at the same time, it's making it impossible for the private sector to stop reducing its debt levels. And it means that both the private sector and the public government sector are causing Europe to spiral further into a depression.
Now, the European Central Bank Chief Mario Draghi has suggested buying government bonds. What difference will this make in the long term?
Well, if the central bank buys those bonds, it's effectively underwriting the deficit the government runs. And that, therefore, is more effective than if it tries to sell those bonds to the public, where the public might refuse to pay them or might want a higher interest rate. So what Draghi's suggesting is quite sensible. The central bank should be functioning largely as an underwriter for what the government is doing, and what Draghi is proposing is pretty much that.
Now, why is it that they're giving France and Italy this leeway? Is it because of their status as two of Europe's top economies?
Well, I think because nobody has ever... The European rules come out of the Maastricht Treaty, which set a maximum level of government debt of 60% of GDP and a maximum deficit of 3% of GDP. And way back in 1992, Wynne Godley, who's a progressive economist, said that these are insane rules that will force Europe into a Great Depression when the next downturn comes. He's quite right. So the rules themselves were never sustainable. Most countries in Europe never actually met them, but they ignored them while the economy was growing. Now that the economy is shrinking, they're actually enforcing the rules and therefore making the situation worse. So it really is quite like watching a Mad Hatter's Tea Party and wondering how long it's going to take to reach their senses and stop behaving like a Mad Hatter.
Professor Steve Keen, thank you very much for joining us.